Hey there, I'm Jessica Lauren Walton, and this is my interview corner. If there's a cool story in the security field or just something that I think will be helpful for my fellow professionals, then I want to talk about it. To learn more about the work I do, you can go check out my blog at jessicawaltonwriter.com. Today's guest is retired United States two-star General Gregg Martin. We're going to talk about his recently published book, Bipolar General, My Forever War with Mental Illness. This is a very brave and educational story about a high-achieving individual who struggled for years with severe bipolar disorder, type 1, and has transformed his life as a result with lessons for the rest of us. As someone who struggled from the same mental illness as General Martin in my late teens and a good part of my 20s, I'm definitely very touched by his honest account of his struggles with the disease, and I fully support his efforts to smash the stigma. Okay, so before we jump in, just a little bit of background on General Martin. To say that he was an overachiever is a little bit of an understatement. So he served in the US military for over 3 decades. His career basically got started in 1979 when he first graduated from the prestigious West Point Military Academy and went on to serve as a career engineer officer deployed to combat zones across the globe. In a ridiculously short amount of time, I think around 5 years, he earned 2 master's degrees and a PhD from MIT. He played an instrumental role as a brigade commander in the Iraq War from 2002 to 2004 and has been involved extensively in leadership and education roles across the defense community, including as president of National Defense University. Today, Gregg is a dedicated mental health advocate. In addition to reading his book, you can learn more about the work he does by checking out bipolargeneral.com. All right, I think I've said enough. So let's get in there and start talking to General Gregg Martin. Hey, General Gregg Martin, thank you for joining me today, and thank you for your service to the security of the United States. I'm excited to talk to you about your recently published book, Bipolar General, My Forever War with Mental Illness. You talk about your incredible 30-plus year career in the military along with your struggles with mental illness, which eventually forced your retirement in 2014. As you know, I've also struggled with bipolar disorder. So your story definitely hit me in the gut. But I'm grateful that you chose to share your story, which I know is part of your mission in smashing the stigma around mental illness. So thank you again for joining me today, and I'm very excited to have this conversation.
Well, thanks so much, Jessica. It's wonderful to be with you, and I look forward to our conversation.
Terrific. So until I read your book, I had actually never heard of the term hyperthymia. Um, so I realized before we dive into your story, for those who may not be familiar with the mood temperament of hyperthymia or the disease of bipolar disorder, maybe you can give a brief summary of, what these are and then explain your case in more detail.
Sure, I had never heard of it either until I
Yeah.
read a fantastic book called A First-Rate Madness, Uncovering the Links Between Leadership and Mental Illness by Nasir Gami, who's a professor at Tufts University Med School. And this book is fantastic. It helped me see and understand myself to a level that I hadn't previously. And what it is, it's a series of historical case studies of famous leaders that analyzes their state of mental health. And there's three that are analyzed who have bipolar disorder. William Tecumseh Sherman from the Civil War, Winston
Hmm.
Churchill, and Ted Turner. And then he goes into two characters with hyperthymia or hyperthymic personalities. And they were Franklin Delano Roosevelt and John F. Kennedy. And when I read that, I said, that was me. I was like those guys, my personality. And the reason it mattered to me was once I had been diagnosed in 2014, my question to the psychiatrist was, okay, I believe you that, my onset was in Iraq in 2003, but what did I have before that? Because we didn't flip a switch and suddenly I went from, completely mentally well with no issues at all to suddenly I had bipolar disorder. I said there was a gradual buildup that took place over years and decades. So what did I have? And none of them could answer that question. Nobody. I looked all through DSM-5, the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual, and there's no talk at all about a bipolar spectrum or these mood temperaments. So I started doing research, and what I found is that the literature is packed with information about this. There's a guy, I forget his name exactly. It's like Hassop or Alsop. He wrote decades ago, but he talked all about the mood temperaments. He talked about a bipolar spectrum. He talked about hyperthymia, but it never got into the mainstream of American psychiatry, and it never got a place in the DSM. So when I read Nasir Ghami's book, I said, that's the answer. This is what happened to me. So I got a hold of Ghami and we started talking, and we had a bunch of conversations, and we Zoomed, and he gave me other things to read by this really famous psychiatrist from decades ago. The name might have been Halsop, but essentially what Ghami said is, look, you were born with a bipolar brain, you lived on the bipolar spectrum, you had hyperthymia, and then it rose gradually over years and decades until your onset of real bipolar disorder at age 47, and then the continued upward glide path until you went into full-blown mania and then acute depression. So what hyperthymia is, it's a near continuous state of low-level mania. So where hypomania is episodic cases of low-level mania, hyperthymia is nearly continuous. You have it almost all the time. So like for me, what it meant was my brain was producing and distributing excess amounts of dopamine, endorphins, other powerful chemicals, and giving me continuously high levels of energy, enthusiasm, drive, creativity, problem-solving skills, positivity, extroversion, and the like. And it continued to go upward from the time I was probably a teenager into my 40s, and it brought me ultimately very close to real mania in my early 40s. But I didn't have my actual onset until Iraq at age 47 in 2003. And that was based on the independent investigation of both the Veteran Affairs, the VA, and the Army Medical Department. So that's what hyperthymia is. And if you have it, it's a tremendous advantage, except for one thing. It often leads to real mania. And so this low mania that is a performance enhancing drug, which is what it is, can morph into something really dangerous, which happened with me.
Right. And your case, I just want to point out, is definitely an unusual case. My case is unusual for other reasons, but at least the onset of when I started to exhibit symptoms is actually classic. Like most people who have bipolar disorder start to show signs of it in their late teens or early 20s. And there's also, to differentiate, there's bipolar 1, which we have, which has more of a tendency towards mania. And then there is bipolar 2, which is a little less destructive form, I would say, of the disease, but still, quite potent. But that has more of a tendency towards depression and with hypomanic episodes, not necessarily full-blown mania. There's also something called cyclothymia, right? So that's actually what I was diagnosed with originally as a teenager. And this was when I was an immigrant in Israel. So I just wanted to point out, like, my family was not, there or aware of what my behavior was becoming. And cyclothymia is rapid cycling between those two poles of mania and depression on a daily basis. And like hyperthymia, if it is not treated, it can become full-blown bipolar disorder, which is very destructive. So that's what happened to me. I was left untreated for whatever reason. That was, the psychiatrist's decision. I wasn't very educated about the disease. And by the time I was 20, I mean, I was basically standing, in the entrance of a psychiatric ward in a hospital outside Tel Aviv. So, yeah, I just really appreciate you, you know, just courageously sharing this and again bringing awareness, to this disease. So right, so my what's unusual about my case is that I eventually was able to get off my medication. Most people are on this medication for the rest of their lives. So um, we have managed though. We've
Yeah.
each managed. And yeah, so when did you start having the first symptoms of bipolar disorder? When did you start realizing like that something was wrong? And how did you react to that?
Well, one thing first, my youngest son also was
Yeah.
diagnosed with cyclothymia, and then over a number of years, he was upgraded to bipolar disorder type 2. And so the three, you've got hyperthymia where you're continuously up, cyclothymia where it's, sort of up and down. It's like, kind of like mini bipolar disorder. And then you
Yeah.
have dysthymia, which is a near continuous level, low level of depression. And so anyway, that's really interesting. So I never realized there was anything wrong with me until I went into various states of depression after my onset. So my onset was in 2003 in Iraq, and I shot into mania, and I was manic for pretty much the whole year
What was
until
going on? Just to take a step back, what was going on in your life at this time? If you want to talk a little bit about your involvement in the war in Iraq and how that, affected your mood stability.
Sure. So I
Yeah.
was a brigade commander in charge of, thousands of troops, combat engineers, and we trained for close to a year in Germany. Very intense, very precise training. Then we had all the administration, all the medical readiness, all the logistics, the maintenance of thousands of pieces of equipment. And, so very, very intense period of time where we knew we were going to invade Iraq, and we were the chosen unit. It was U.S. Army Fifth Corps. We were going to be the main effort to attack from Kuwait to Baghdad. And so we knew all that. So there was enormous stress and pressure. And then, of course, we got the deployment order, and we put all our equipment on railroads, on trains, and railed them to the coast, and then put them on huge ships, shipped them down through the Suez Canal, the Red Sea, up to Kuwait. And meanwhile, we picked up a dozen Zionist monsters, the D9 up-armored bulldozers
I
we
saw
picked up
this.
from Israel. Those things were awesome, and they played a really big role in the urban combat. And we were pivotal on providing the mobility and the survivability for the attacking force. And the Corps, Fifth Corps, was about 100,000 troops. And so we attacked up the Euphrates River Valley, very active enemy in defense all the way. Lots of guerrilla fighting at the beginning down in the southern part of Iraq, where they attacked us like suicide attacks. Big battles, a lot of people killed. We cleared all the rubble, debris, destroyed airplanes, vehicles, dead bodies, unexploded ordnance. And then we attacked into the heart of the city and seized the Republican palaces right downtown. And then the regime fell, and it was a weird situation where the major fighting was over, but then slowly the guerrilla terrorist warfare picked up, and then the enemy started. We didn't have enough troops to seal the borders, so
Yeah.
fighters and militias started coming in from, Iran, from Syria, from all the countries surrounding Iraq. And then
Wow.
we soon found ourselves in this vicious guerrilla war where, foreign fighters, Al Qaeda, you name it, Iranians, they were all there. They were armed to the teeth. They had, they were making and using improvised explosive devices, which were the biggest killer on the battlefield. They were plundering the huge weapon stocks that Saddam had amassed. And again, we didn't have enough troops to secure these things.
It was over a year of high intensity stress, of uncertainty, I'm sure not sleeping a lot, and just a tremendous
Uh,
amount of responsibility. And then, as you expressed in your story, the frustration of how the war turned out, the decisions that were made that were out of your hands, and also going to a lot of funerals of soldiers, which I'm sure was incredibly painful. So it's understandable that that could have a real physical, mental impact, moving forward with your life.
Absolutely. And where I first went into mania was when we attacked from Kuwait into Iraq. We breached the big berms on the border,
Hmm.
and then boom, we're inside Iraq, another country, and we're attacking into it, with tanks and artillery and attack aircraft and everything. And I felt myself shoot into mania. I didn't know it was mania, but that's what it was in retrospect. And I suddenly felt like Superman, like I was bulletproof, that I could do anything. And I was circulating all over the battlefield, checking on missions and the
Yeah.
troops. And it was a phenomenal feeling. And the different psychiatrists have said that it was much more powerful high than being on cocaine or ecstasy. And so that mania continued for quite a while until the disillusionment set in with these different government policies. And then the guerrilla war, which was really nasty, and a lot of people started getting killed and wounded. And then I started having short dips into depression and
Right.
a little bits of psychosis. And that pretty much took me through the year in Iraq. But when I got back to Germany, our home base, then I fell into depression. I mean, real depression. And I went to the doctors and said, "Hey, there's something
Yeah.
wrong with me. I'm always up. I'm never down, and I'm really down. What can you do to help me?" And they said and this happened a total of 3 times over the next several years where I was
Yeah.
depressed and I thought there was something wrong. And they said, "Well, what do you do to counteract the depression?" And I said, "Well, I try to work really hard, which is a good antidote. Second, I would exercise with intense physical training, which was really hard to do when I was depressed. It really was difficult. Um, Third, I would listen to very inspirational rock and roll music. Fourth, I would repeat power verses out of the Bible. All those power
Yeah.
verses that tell you, hey, God's going to be with me and strengthen me and lift me up. And then when that didn't work, which none of that ever did work, what I did was drink at night when I was off
Yeah.
duty. I drank alcohol. And so the doctors, this is 3 of them over a period of years, they said, "Oh, you're fine. There's nothing wrong with you." And what they failed to do was to, get collateral information that said, "Hey, this guy Martin is always up, full of energy. Now he's down. What's going on?" And they could have begun to put together, connect the dots of
Hmm.
having bipolar disorder, but they just didn't. And so and then there were 3 times I went to the doctor because I was ordered to, after I was fired and forced to retire in 2014. I went to the doctor, but I was in a state of full blown mania. And again, they said, "You're fine. There's nothing wrong with you." And they were wrong. Again, 6 times in a row, they were wrong. But on the seventh time, when I was in the worst depression ever, plus psychosis, plus wanting to die, at that point, I went to the doctor and said, "Hey, there is something wrong with me." And that was in November of 2014. And then finally, they said, "Oh, you have bipolar disorder type 1 with psychosis." And it was one little tidbit of collateral information that gave them that finding. They asked my wife, "What do you think?" And my wife said, "I think he was manic, and now I think he's
Yeah.
depressed." And so she told the doctors that, and then they said, "Aha, okay, maybe he's bipolar."
Right. Well, we'll get to that. I want to really unpack that, like all the things that went wrong along the way, because I know there are certain maybe cultural factors, such as you're high-ranking general, so people were a little nervous to do certain things, right, at a certain point. But I think even for the average patient, I think it just kind of shows how hard it can be to get a diagnosis, because this is a disease with ups and downs and even normal periods in between. And so if the doctor is only depending on your report, by the way, you have these funny emojis popping out on the screen, but here and there, it's okay. We can leave them.
That's weird.
Don't worry about it. I just thought it was funny. But anyhow, yeah, it's just it shows how hard it can be to diagnose somebody without external information like reports from other people, such as your wife, later on from your colleagues. But before I like dig into that, right, and we can also talk about like what could have been done differently, the lessons learned. Um, I wanted to talk about something with your personality, right? Like you were known as the wild man, right? That was your nickname. Um, and so people saw that high level of energy as being a natural part of your personality. So that was really interesting for me to read, because it's actually an uncomfortable truth, I think, about this particular disease. And you bring it up in the beginning of your book, right? That sometimes the line blurs between an individual's personality and the various stages, right, of the disease as it progresses. And so this was something that like I could definitely relate to, because I was used to being a very high energy, animated person, somebody who loves to tell stories, right? But when I first started taking the lithium, even though people around me were reflecting, oh, wow, you're like normal, you're like easier to deal with now. Like it was a good thing from their perspective. Um, from my perspective, I felt kind of flattened out. I didn't feel that I was as animated as I used to be, because I had trouble differentiating between the mania and my naturally exuberant personality. I think that's something you could definitely relate to. So looking back over the years, have you been able to draw that clear line between the illness and your personality?
No, it's
No.
it. I,
Yeah.
I I don't think it's really a clear line. I think it's a blurry line where, I mean, I had and still have a a particular personality, and the personality is, up, energetic, enthusiastic, fun loving, like to
Right.
party, like being around people. And so that is my personality. But what happens is the combination of the army culture, like the army has kind of a wild side to its culture. I mean, not everybody, not the whole army, not all the time, but it is looked upon favorably to be kind of a partier, a little bit on the wild side,
Yeah.
a little bit irreverent, a little bit over the edge, kind of a maverick. I mean, it's admired, and it's a sub personality of the U.S. Army, and so I had kind of all of that too. And then what happened is, being on the bipolar spectrum and with this hyperthymia, this ever increasing hyperthymia, I started doing and behaving in more um, kind of wild ways, doing kind of things that were, over the edge, a little bit out of bounds, a little bit extreme. And there's a theory that I learned from one of my psychiatric mentors, and it's called the kindling effect. And the way the professor explained it to me, she said that once you have a bipolar brain, that you start off at a very low level, like just a little flame of bipolar. And then once you have an event, it's like throwing a little bit of kindling wood on the flame,
Yeah.
and the fire gets a little bigger, and then sticks, and then logs, and then big logs, and then pretty soon you have a raging bonfire. And that definitely happened to me. The kindling effect, no doubt, helps explain my rise on that bipolar spectrum.
So can
And
you give an
meanwhile, though,
example of something you did that was a little out of character, that might have been a sign that something was starting to overkindle in your system?
um, yes. So there's a few, and they're different. when I left high school, I didn't get into West Point right away. I went to the University of Maine. And I went to Maine and I had very poor study habits. And so my grades, I was taking an engineering curriculum at a big university, and it was very hard. And I had bad study habits. And so before you knew it, within a couple of months, I had all Fs, straight Fs. And I fell into a terrible first depression of my life. And I had, in high school, I was like, I was the most popular guy. I was the best athlete. I was the best student.
Yeah.
And so suddenly I went from high school hero to college zero. I mean, no girls wanted to go out with me. It was terrible. And so it was very, very depressing. But what happened was these college missionaries knocked on my door in my dorm room, and they said, "Hey, and this was the first significant religious event of what became a really major theme of my life was religion and religiosity. And they said, "Hey, are you going to go to heaven?" I said, "I don't know." "Are you a Christian?" "I think so." "Hey, do you know Jesus?" "I don't really know." And on and on and on. And these missionaries are very skilled in telling this story and getting people to agree with them and to become, quote, born again Christians. And so I went through this whole thing, and I'm like, hey, I have nothing to lose. I have all Fs. I'm really depressed. So I'd like said the prayer with them and became a, quote, born again Christian. And what happened immediately, it was unbelievable. I felt like 100 pounds lifted off my shoulders, and I shot into what I now know is mania. And I just felt great. I started memorizing the Bible verses they gave me, started going to prayer breakfasts, retreats, Protestant church services, even though I was a Catholic. I cleaned my room, my dorm room. I got my books and notebooks out, and I got all organized, and I developed my schedule, and I became this very disciplined student. And within a couple of months, I went from all Fs to Dean's List. Now,
Wow.
I asked the missionaries. I said, "What do you explain? How do you explain this turnabout?" And they said, "Oh, that's the Holy Spirit." And so whether it was the Holy Spirit or mania or hypomania or some combination, I don't know. I mean, God can do what he wants, but he lifted me up out of the pits. And so I think that was my first significant bipolar-like episode. And it really put some pretty big sticks and maybe some logs on my fire. Then I went to Germany. Well, here's another one. I went to Army Ranger School, which I know you're familiar with. But we were food deprived, sleep deprived. We were trudging in the middle of the winter, snow and ice on the ground, up this steep mountain range in northern Georgia, and I was starving to death. And suddenly, I hallucinated that I had lifted up out of my body and was looking down at me and the 10-man patrol. And I saw myself down below, and I saw like these bubbles like in a cartoon, and I saw a hot plate of steaming spaghetti and meatballs. And I'm like, oh, I want to go eat some because I was so hungry. And then I zipped back into my body. But that was a hallucination, not that different from what I later had that I was flying over Washington, D.C. And so that was an experience, even though it was psychosis. I think it was part of the bipolar experience. And then, when I was in Germany as a young officer, I would wake up at 4 a.m, do farm chores, run to work, do PT, work like crazy all day long, play basketball with the troops, lift weights, finish my work at whatever hour it took. And then I'd run back through the woods 4 miles, back to the farm, do more farm chores. Then I'd go out on the town with my friends, and we would go out and party all night. We would sing karaoke. We would dance. We'd eat all this good German food. And so that was
pretty. Oh my God, Gregg, if you were my commander, I think you would have killed me.
The other thing we would do is we would, on a Friday afternoon, we would jump in the car, throw our skis in the car, and we would drive to Austria, which was about a 6 or 7 hour drive, get to Austria, party all night long on the Friday night, get up, ski all day Saturday, party all Saturday night, ski all day Sunday, and then drive back on Sunday night. And we would get back to our base, American base, just in time for physical training first thing in the morning on a Monday morning. And we did that weekend after weekend. And then the
Wow.
final one I'll just share with you that is really, really powerful is, after when I was a captain, the Army's got this really good program where they take officers with the most talent and potential, and they send them to fully funded civilian graduate school. And so I got picked, and the Army said, okay, your mission is to get one master's degree in engineering. So I went to school at MIT, and I ended up coming out of it with two masters, and then shortly thereafter, a PhD. Now that, Jessica, is not normal behavior. That might, I mean, I was, at least hypomanic that whole time, but my brain could absorb vast quantities of information. I could take complexity, focus like a laser, solve
Yeah.
really hard problems. I
Yep.
could read, and understand a book a night. I could go through problem sets a maniac, which is what I was. And I think if anybody had been thinking about things back then and they had seen what I accomplished at, a really challenging school, they would have said, wow, is this guy okay? Is he normal? This is really strange. But instead, all they saw was
Yeah.
success.
Right.
Senior, this guy's a superstar. And so those are a few examples. I could go on, but that's a few examples of
Yeah.
early on bipolar symptoms.
Yeah. No, I think you touch upon, another key point is that it's certain stages of this disease, there really are benefits. There's studies done about, artists, right, with bipolar disorder, and that at certain stages of their careers, whether we're talking about painters or writers, that, being a little manic, gave them this creative edge. But then it was also destructive, and bipolar disorder also has a very high suicide rate. Another character that I'm thinking about right now, fictional character, is Carrie Matheson. She's a CIA agent with bipolar disorder in a popular, it's a hit TV series, Homeland. And some complaints that people had right after the series came out was it was actually a very realistic portrayal of bipolar disorder. People are saying, like, is it a portrayal of showing like that everybody with this disorder has some level of genius and creativity, right? Some people do, and some people don't. And there are even scenes where Carrie will purposely go off her medication because she wants a little extra edge. She wants to get a little manic to like solve a difficult case. So I was thinking about that example. But yeah, I think this is touching upon another, uncomfortable or controversial truth about the disorder, that there are sometimes advantages, right, to having this illness. So, you were describing right now, throughout your military career, you had these extraordinary levels of, energy and creativity. And because you were successful, people didn't think anything is wrong, even if it was a little unusual. Um, and so looking back, I mean, if you had been treated for hyperthymia, right, that time, most likely you wouldn't have been able to accomplish all these amazing things that you were doing. But eventually the disease advanced to a point that it was highly destructive to your life. So I guess my question to you, is there like a way to enjoy the benefits of bipolar disorder, without suffering the consequences of a full-blown disease?
I think there probably is, but I think it would be very, very difficult to actually do. I mean, I had a long talk with Professor Gami about this and with other psychiatrists. You would have to be able to discern the hyperthymia and be able to make a judgment that this is a mental condition, not a mental illness, but a condition. And then, right now, it's not current practice to treat people with hyperthymia.
Right.
There's no record of that. So there's ethical issues, and whether the psychiatrist could get in trouble for maltreatment if they did that. But all of that aside, if they could discern that a person has hyperthymia or a low level of mania and treat it with, say, micro doses of lithium or some other medication and take the edge off it so that you wouldn't keep getting higher and higher, but you would stabilize and get into a quote unquote normal mood. I think it could work, but I don't think there's an appetite in the psychiatric community to do that for a variety of reasons. But I would say yes, it could work. And if somebody had detected in me that somewhere in the mix of personality, army culture, and mental illness, that there was something going on, and they had taken those proactive steps, I think it could have probably, leveled me out and kept me from going higher and higher and higher, and ultimately, almost self-destructing entirely. I think it is possible, and it could have happened, but I think the chances of it happening, based on my conversations with psychiatrists, are very low.
Because hyperthymia was not really destructive in any way. If anything, it gave you this edge, right? And why would you want to take, even if you had recognized it, why would you want to give up that edge? That's really tough. I mean,
Right.
I've thought about it like, also like looking back, is it better to live a life of extremes where you can get like tremendous amounts of things done, just tremendous accomplishments, very satisfying things in your life, but then risk crashing in a very, deep way versus living a more consistent existence? It's something that actually rabbis talk about, since we were bringing up religious backgrounds, right? It's something, that I've seen Rabbi Dean Steinsaltz talk about, for example, what kind of living is a better way of living? It's kind of a complex question. Obviously, you didn't know at the time that you were going to be crashing into such, a terrible depression, right, in your late 40s. But I guess this is more of a philosophical question. I mean, if you had a crystal ball, right, you could look back and say, would I have wanted to be treated for hyperthymia at that point in my life, knowing that, you were accomplishing so many things? Would you have accepted that in order to, not have that terrible episode of depression that you had later in life?
Well, that's a fantastic question. I
It's a tough
loved
one,
my
right?
Yeah, I would say I loved my life. I loved what hyperthymia did for me. I loved my time in the army, being an army leader in charge of, people and doing exciting, dangerous, important things. It was great. I mean, it was wonderful. And I was in great physical condition, worked out all the time, traveled, wonderful marriage, kids, wife, um, lots of friends. So I loved all of that. But the crash, getting fired, forced to retire, hospitalized, living in bipolar hell for 2 years,
Yeah.
wanting nothing, only to die, like every day for 2 years, just wanting to die. That was terrible. I mean, it was horrible.
Yeah.
I mean, it was just the worst experience by far of my life. But Jessica, what's amazing is now, since my journey of recovery and started in 2016, so 8 years ago, now I've got my life back again, and it's really I've got a very purposeful, happy, healthy life. I love doing this, bipolar mental health advocacy. I think it's probably the most exciting, important work I've ever done, even more than the army. And I mean, I get to meet like phenomenal people like yourself and have conversations and talk about, bipolar disorder and mental health. So, God works in mysterious ways. And I never thought I would say this, but in a, kind of a ironic way, the bipolar disorder has worked for good because of my position as a retired general and my story and background and everything. I've got kind of a stature to talk about these things that most other people don't have. And so I'm really able to make a huge difference in terms of stopping stigma, helping people with recovery, saving lives, making a positive difference. So I guess that's a long way to say, I don't think I would change it. I'd go through
Oh,
it all again.
wow. Yeah. No, it's incredible what you're doing today, and that you've found another way to bring satisfaction and meaning into your life. I think that's not just an issue for somebody who's lived an intense life like you have in the military and overseas, but for anybody going into retirement, it's always like, well, what is the next step for me? I'm not there yet, right? But I have parents who went into retirement and, they had to ask that question. Um, so I think the way you've managed it and just the gratitude that you have, what did you call it in the book? Attitude of gratitude. I love that. I'm going to
Right.
keep that. Yeah, no, I think that's really powerful, and just you're an incredible role model, showing that like, hey, I'm not going to go hide from this. I want to talk about it. I want to use my stature, my platform, to talk about this, bring education, awareness, and hopefully improvements. So going back to this whole situation with the psychiatrist that you detail in your book, right? Like, you were not trying to hide anything from anyone. You were honestly like, I think something's wrong, and you kind of got blown off in a way. So my question is, why do you think it took so long for psychiatrists in the military to diagnose you? And, what could have been done differently?
So they were wrong 6 times in a row. So they were 0 for 6. And on the seventh try, they got it right. So here's what I think. There's a number of factors. Number one, when I would go in to see them, they would see a successful senior officer, a colonel or a general, and they knew my background, doctorate from MIT, successful battlefield commander, and in an illustrious, prestigious position. So they had a hard time seeing past this mask of success. So it's like I was standing there in front of them as a person, but all they could see was success. They couldn't see past the mask that I had a sick, diseased brain. And so I think that was a big part of what was going on with them. The second thing is I've been told that diagnosing bipolar disorder is tricky, it's complicated, and it's not easy. And I've been told that from lots of psychiatrists, and they can explain why, but it's just a difficult thing to diagnose. The third thing is these doctors, until the seventh try, they didn't make any apparent effort to get what they call collateral information. So when you go in to see a psychiatrist, you're generally by yourself. You meet with them one-on-one for a meeting that's maybe 20, 30 minutes long. How much information can they really get about you in that environment?
And how do
Whereas
they
if
know
they,
that it's accurate? How do they know it's accurate? Sorry to interrupt, but like something that stuck out to me is, at a certain point, like especially when you're suffering with depression, you had paranoid delusions. And, you said something to the psychiatrist, which was definitely a delusion. Um, but the psychiatrist was like, oh, well, that sounds like a legal issue. Like, he actually thought that was a real thing that you were talking about. But if he had been speaking to other people at the time, they would have said that that's crazy, right? So that like definitely stuck out to me, bothered me actually. So right, it's like if you're not well, how can a doctor make a diagnosis, make a like a very important decision just based on your testimony, which may or may not be very accurate?
yeah, I think he really mishandled the whole thing. He gave me the choice whether to be dealt with aggressively, which would have been hospitalization, probably something like lithium, a strong remedy. Instead, he kept my bipolar disorder. So he's a doctor, and he's got such a stigma against bipolar disorder that he kept it secret and didn't put it in my records until the day before I retired from the Army. I mean, that's really something. And he gave me the choice to, keep it quiet and do a low level of treatment to to basically keep it below the radar screen,
But that
or go
treatment
full.
didn't work. That treatment wasn't working, the low-level
It
treatment.
it
It kept you
was
off the
terrible.
records. Yeah.
Yeah. And when I, like you said, when I was in a panic situation with these delusions that I was being watched, that I was going to be arrested, put in jail, murdered, and he, as a psychiatrist, he should have known this was part of my psychosis. Instead, he's like, "Well, you have to talk to a lawyer. I don't deal with legal questions."
Yeah.
I mean, it was really, really terrible. But the other thing was, Jessica, when I got fired from National Defense University, um, dozens and dozens of people had written anonymous letters to my boss, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs, and said, "Hey, there's something wrong with General Martin. He's acting very strangely, very bizarrely. Here are some observations." And so the chairman and his staff had all this evidence that led them to, remove me from command. But none of that got to the psychiatrists. I mean,
Yeah.
if the psychiatrist had read that stuff, it would be like a textbook. Because I got some of the letters, and it literally was like perfect description of bipolar disorder, as if they'd read DSM-5, and it was so clear that there was something wrong. But the doctors never got those, so they were operating in the blind. And the doctors also, they didn't make an attempt to go to my chain of command and say, "Okay, why did you fire this guy? What was the problem?
Yeah.
What did he do?" And give us the data. And so it was a terrible failure on both sides, the medical and the chain of command, of not sharing information that caused them to so miss the boat.
Yeah. So if you were in charge of reforming that system, what are some key recommendations you would make?
Um, well, I'll start a little bit below that. And I think that there needs to be good comprehensive education and training on what the basic symptoms of the different mental illnesses are. And that needs to take place all across the armed forces so that everybody knows what these diseases look like. Because in my case, I was around thousands of people for a number of years, but nobody knew what they were seeing because they were untrained.
Mm-hmm.
So that would be number one. Number two, I would have a battle buddy system, which the military talks about, but it didn't really do. And a battle buddy system means, let's say you and I were battle buddies. I mean, we would get to know each other. We would have a relationship of trust, respect, complete honesty and candor, where if either of us saw something troubling or wrong in the other's behavior, we could say, "Hey, Jessica, you know, I love you like a sister, but I'm starting to see these troubling things. And I think we should, and I'll go with you, but we should go see a mental health specialist and kind of nip this in the bud." So I think that should be something. I think that the way the military puts emphasis on physical fitness training, which is good, they do a good job. They should put the same emphasis on mental fitness training and make it part of the program. And there have been generals that have done this very, very well. But that would be the next big thing.
I would say,
Um,
by the way, as a side note, that applies also to police, to law enforcement and first responders as well. That's been a complaint that people are trying to improve in their training systems, instead of just focusing on the physical and technical skills, which are obviously important, to also implement some kind of mental health training to prepare people for what they're going to deal with and to have awareness and education so that they can ask for help if needed.
yeah, absolutely. But then using this peer support system, or battle buddy system,
Hmm.
um, keeping an eye on each other, so that both I, as an individual, I have a responsibility to keep an eye on myself, to check myself, to make sure I'm okay, to talk to people that know me. Hey, am I doing okay? Is there any troubling
Hmm.
signs? And so people need to have this system of accountability in terms of mental health and other kinds of health. And then if you do decide, hey, you know there does appear to be some troubling behavior or symptoms, I'll go to the doctor with you. I don't want you to go alone. I
Mm.
care about you. And let me go with you. Maybe let's invite your spouse or your children, or so that you get some more people in the room that can provide collateral information to the doctors and give the doctor a more full, complete picture of what's going on. Those are some of the things that I would recommend. And then I guess finally, I would say, these mental illnesses, bipolar disorder in particular, if untreated, they can lead often to destruction of marriage, family, career, homelessness, addictions, incarceration, and death. That's a pretty that is a fairly predictable outcome of having these diseases and not dealing with them, not working with medical people. The main reason people don't go get help is because of the stigma, which is based on fear and ignorance. So you got to combat the stigma. But on the other hand, if somebody does go get help and they get the right medication, they live a healthy life, they see a therapist, they do all the things you need to do, then there's a very high probability that they can live a healthy, happy, purposeful life. And I think it's important for people to know that the choice is there. And if you do have a problem, one of the things that I said, once I got the diagnosis, November 2014, I said, thank you, doctor. I now know what's wrong with me. I have a target with a face on it that I can, do battle with and start to get better. Right. And I said, I'm going to own this. I am not going to be embarrassed, ashamed, or stigmatized, because it makes no sense, because this is a physiological brain disease. And so right from the get-go, I was completely open and told people, hey, this is the situation. I have bipolar disorder, and here's what I'm doing to get better.
Wow. That's incredible that you had that insight. So thank you for sharing that, because it's very lonely, to be in that place of,
It is.
Fear and isolation. And it's bad enough suffering from the illness, but then being, fearful of the judgment, right? That comes along with that stigma. Yeah, you're right. It's sad to think about how many people who could have asked for help, who could have gotten better, didn't, and went down, the destructive path, that you mentioned. So I also just wanted to talk about something that I think applies to many people, not just people suffering from, a major mental health issue, but just this issue of going from a high intensity environment to something of lower level intensity, right? I mean, that can feel like depression. People, for example, I mean, I've done interviews with other people from the military, and definitely they've described like coming back from combat, right? Which is like really high intensity. You're like, you're on. And then suddenly you come back to your home life, right? To normal civilian life. And it's like people feel really like, whoa, like depressed. I mean, there's even been issues with men who suddenly their testosterone plummets and they need short-term hormone therapy to get back there, right? So, and also just going from, an intense career to retirement for anybody, it can be very difficult psychologically. So how have you adapted going from the high intensity environment that you were in for over 3 decades to the more tranquil life that you're living now?
Well, what you described fits me exactly after the year in Iraq of, intense adrenaline, manic, euphoria, thrilling. When I went back to Germany out of the combat zone, I just crashed into depression that lasted for 10 months. And then I finally, my brain just suddenly pulled out of it. And, Professor Gami said that it was the day-to-day routine and structure of Army garrison life that it just suddenly pulled you out of this depression. But to bring it forward, so after my terrible experience of 2 years of bipolar hell with intense depression, terrifying psychosis, I finally got on the right medication, lithium and a couple others. And I started this journey of recovery. And that was started 8 years ago. And I really needed to rebuild my life, my marriage, my frame of reference, etc. And it took me a couple years to really get my bearings and my feet on the ground. Like I knew I needed to stay healthy and go to the doctor and take my meds and eat healthy and get plenty of sleep and work out and go to the gym and go to the beach. I knew I needed to do those things. But other than religion, I was sort of adrift and I didn't have a clear focus or a clear mission that, really motivated me. And I suddenly realized I've got to get a mission. I have to have a purpose and a mission. And in the Army, it was easy because I had the Army mission and I just did that. I just did my part of the big Army mission and it worked fine. But I finally realized I don't have a mission. I need a mission. And after some amount of talking to elders, people I respected, reading a lot, praying a lot, trying to really get in touch with myself spiritually, I came to the realization that my purpose, my mission was me right in front of me with my bipolar disorder, that this is it. And so I carved out a mission statement, which is kind of an Army thing. You got to have a mission statement. And so my statement was sharing my bipolar story to help stop the stigma, promote recovery, and save lives. And I do it by speaking, writing, and conferring with people. And so that's my mission. That's what I do. And it has just, then I wrote the book, and I've written a bunch of articles and all these talks and interviews. And it has become it is the driving force in my life. And I love doing it. It's so much fun. And I get to meet people like you and have interesting conversations. It's fantastic. So I've been able to, in the last, I'd say 4 years, really, really pick up the pace. And my life now is pretty high speed, pretty intense. And the one thing I have to do is to dial it back, ratchet it back so it doesn't get too busy and too intense. And so I've been working on that as well.
You're obviously somebody who's very reactive to your environment as well. I was just thinking, when you're describing a lot of these incidents of the ups and downs, right? I mean, you were very reactive to what's going on around you, to your environment, which makes sense because I think you mentioned in the book that you scored, was it the Myers-Briggs? You scored like really high on the extrovert scale,
Right.
right? So that makes sense, right? Because an extrovert is very much like in tune and feeding off of their environment as opposed to somebody who's more introverted. Um, so yeah, I just think that's like really interesting that obviously you are connected to a mission that means a lot to you. It's extremely gratifying. You still are living, full force your life, which is wonderful. But you also recognize, hey, maybe things are a little intense and maybe I should step back a little from this situation because I don't want to ignite internally, a reaction that's not going to be healthy for me. So you've learned to kind of check yourself.
Yes, exactly. I mean, you described it perfectly. And having my wife Maggie, who is, she can read me very well. So she's like having another therapist 24/7. And then, my therapist and psychiatrist are good to work with. And I've met other doctors. I've got a, a psychiatrist who I've become really good friends with, who is really fantastic. We've done a lot of work together, and so she's almost like another psychiatrist. She's out at University of Illinois, but
Mhm.
that's helpful too. So I've kind of surrounded myself with a little army of people that are aware of my situation and help look out for me.
Yeah, you've built like a very positive infrastructure or community around you, which I think is just so important for the healing process, no matter like what you've been through in your life. So, finishing up, what is the main piece of wisdom that you want to share with people based on your experience?
Mental illness and bipolar disorder, they are an equal opportunity destroyer of lives. So it doesn't matter if you are, a CEO or a janitor, a general or a private, whether you're black or white, male or female, if it wants you, it's going to come get you. And it can be absolutely destructive of everything. And so when you're going through this pain and destruction and hardship, it's easy to fall into a situation where you think, I'll never get better. And I didn't think, when I was in bipolar hell, I thought, I'm never going to get better. This is going to be my life. Just terrible torture, just let me die. But there's always hope that you can, if you get the right help and the right treatment and you have the right people around you, you can get better. I mean, I'm a living example of it. So I think this idea of hope is really, really important. I think the second big thing is stigma. Stigma is just such a barrier to people having hope and getting better. And, we know scientifically that these mental illnesses are physiological in nature. So they really shouldn't be looked at differently than diabetes, heart disease, cancer. And they should be accepted as part of, the physical condition, only it happens to be in the brain, so it's invisible. I think that that's really important, and that we normalize the conversation around mental health. I would just close with saying resources. There are loads of books and movies and documentaries about bipolar disorder and other mental illnesses. I'm just going to mention a few that are the most significant to me. I mean, I hate to put myself first, but I actually think my book, Bipolar General, My Forever War with Mental Illness, is just chock full of good advice, lessons learned, examples, strategies for dealing with bipolar disorder. So I would say that's a really good resource. The book I mentioned earlier, A First-Rate Madness by Nasir Ghami, that is a phenomenal book. There's another book by Sarah Schley, and it's called Brainstorm. And Sarah is a good friend of mine, and she writes about her experience with bipolar type 2. So you have me with bipolar 1, Ghami with all kinds of conditions that he's analyzing, and then Sarah with bipolar type 2 condition. So those are a couple of those are just a few books. There's many, many more. The other thing is that Sarah and others, and I'm on the film team, we're actually making a documentary film called brainstormthefilm.com. It's going to be a PBS documentary on bipolar disorder. It's going to come out next year, and you can find out about it on just brainstormthefilm.com. There's another piece of innovation. This professor at Illinois that I told you about, she has devised a special keyboard on the iPhone, and she's a very mathematical person as well as a psychiatrist. It's called biaffect.com, biaffect.com. And with Biaffect, it can basically track the strokes on the keyboard, and it can monitor your mood, and it can predict when you're going into mania or depression, and then give early warning, and then thus can take preemptive steps to help deal with it. And then the final thing, there's a company called their website is grithope.com. It's a company that has worked with first responders, military veterans, universities, and they specialize in mental health and resiliency. And they've got a lot of good resources that are worth taking a look at. So anyway, those are a few of my closing thoughts.
Wow. Okay. Well, you're definitely fighting the good fight. No pun intended, as you're from the military. But I'm just really blown away. I feel really honored to get to connect with you. Hopefully to collaborate with you in the future. I'm just, it's really touching, to see somebody who went through, such a difficult life experience, but to come out of it the other side, so connected to mission. And something else that stuck out to me, I just wanted to say about your personality throughout the book is that you're like a really caring person. You're not just an extrovert in the sense that you like to socialize and party, but you really value being connected to people. So I think that's your saving grace, but that's also like become part of your mission is to keep that connection going. So thank you so much for your time today. I really appreciate it. And I'm looking forward to seeing what you do next.